You see this reflected in the so-called lying flat generation, a lot of the youth who can't find jobs commensurate with their education level. You see it in the capital flight, the wealthy who are trying to get their kids and their money out of the country as quickly as possible. A whole host of indicators suggest that all is not right with China's economy. And I think a lot of people have been saying this slowdown in China's economy was entirely predictable. A lot of people think that the rise of China was the normal thing, that China would just rise forever, that's just what it does, and that anyone who argues that it's going to slow down doesn't know what they're talking about. But in retrospect, we now know that China's rise was the exceptional event. It was the weird thing that usually does not happen in the international system, and it was propelled by a few fleeting circumstances, a few fleeting tailwinds that have now become headwinds that are dragging China back down. So I just want to walk you through some of these. The first of these tailwinds turned headwinds is just basic security. For much of the last 40 years, China has had the most secure geopolitical position of any time in its modern history. And that's really important because China, as you know, is in a very rough neighborhood. It's surrounded by 19 countries, most of which are powerful or unstable or both. If you play the geopolitical board game Risk, you know that trying to hang on to the territory of China is damn near impossible, and that's what China has to do every single day. And for big parts of its modern history, China failed to do this. So for 100 years, from the first Opium War in 1839 until the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, China just gets ripped apart by imperialist powers. It collapses into two of the worst civil wars in history. And then even after the Chinese Communist Party unifies the country in 1949, China almost immediately becomes the chief enemy of the United States because of the Korean War and the direct fighting between the two countries. And then 10 years later, China's alliance with the Soviet Union falls apart. And so by the 1960s, China is the top enemy of both Cold War superpowers. And not surprisingly, it's isolated and impoverished. So it's not till 1971 and the opening to the United States that China starts to get some reprieve from this geopolitical vice, because now it has a superpower on its side. And the Americans actually warn the Soviet Union on multiple occasions, do not attack China, otherwise we're going to have a problem with that. The Americans also fast-track China's entry into Western markets, and the timing of China's opening up is perfect. So China starts to join the global economy right as this period that we now call hyper-globalization kicks in. So this is the period where in 30 years, from the 1970s to the early 2000s, world trade and investment surges 6+ fold. China both propels and rides this wave to become what we know of it today, which is this dominant workshop of the world, a huge manufacturing power, and a rising economy. The second factor that China really needed for its rise was decent government. So in 1976, Mao dies, and China's leaders basically say, let's not do another cultural revolution. And so they start to reward lower-level Chinese leaders for good economic performance, not just blind loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. Actually, ironically, the Cultural Revolution itself so destroyed the state planning apparatus that there just weren't as many Chinese bureaucrats running around telling the peasants what they could and couldn't do. And so the Chinese people were partially freed from that rigid state plan, and they basically formed quasi-private markets and industries and started trading, and you had this big boom of economic activity. And the Chinese Communist Party eventually started to begrudgingly accept that and then expand the range of quasi-private markets around the country. So China had the right policies to capitalize on its new opportunities at the right time. A third crucial factor was the greatest demographic dividend in human history.